I don't need to tell you, I assume, that we are here gathered under unusual circumstances. Needless to say, neither we nor the Bernie Sanders campaign knew a month ago when we last gathered here that they would choose to have a rally in this place at this time on this day. Had we known that, we might have tried to deal with the situation, although I don't know how we could have, but we might have tried. I want to remind you all that while we love you all, you are roughly 100 and, it varies from month to month, but between 100 and 150 people. And we estimate somewhere between 50 and 60,000 see the video. So we're going to continue tonight, in part because we don't want to disappoint all those people who expect this and who listen to it and who look for it. And so we determined that even if only a handful could get through, and clearly it's more than a handful, we should proceed. So we are going to do that. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for braving the elements, the crowds, the evidence that the country is changing on a scale that is way ahead of what anyone, or almost anyone, could have foreseen. Let me start in my usual way. Thank you all for coming. I want to remind you all that there are 3 groups that sponsor these monthly meetings. The Left Forum is one, and I want to remind you also that the Left Forum will occur next month after our meeting, and we will have the second Wednesday again of the month in May. I don't have in my head right now what that is, but the second Wednesday. And then on the 20th, 21st and 22nd of May, the Left Forum will take place at the John Jay School of Criminal Justice up on West 59th Street in Manhattan. And I urge you all to take a look at leftforum.org, which is where you can find out everything about it. There will be over 400 panels. We've already had those submitted and processed them. So we fully expect that the attendance at this year's Left Forum will be more or less what it has been the last several years. That's a total attendance of between 4,500 and 5,000 people. And the plenaries and speakers and so on you can get by looking at leftforum.org. The second sponsor, beside the Left Forum, is the Judson Memorial Church that you are sitting in, a very old historic place which has been the scene of all kinds of activities, and whether or not Mr. Sanders and his team knew it, it was an interesting thing to decide to have their activities in front of this church. I don't know whether they knew that or not, but it is part of what this church has always done, which is one of the reasons we're here, because the church has a sympathy with what we are trying to do. So the third organization is Democracy at Work, and that's what I work with, and that's what produces all of these events, and that has the video produced in the back here that's posted on YouTube and then picked up all over the world in a whole host of other websites that we can't even keep track of, which is part of how the web works. So let me remind you all that the major topic tonight is socialism. The varieties of it, the history of it, where it's going, where it's been, in order to both situate the Bernie Sanders phenomena that is literally exploding around us, but also to open, or maybe I should better say, to reopen the conversation about socialism that has had such a hard time in the United States for the last half century. If someone were to ask me, and indeed some folks have, what are the biggest achievements of the Bernie Sanders campaign, I would answer as follows. The 2 biggest achievements, which are already achievements, They are achievements irrespective of what the outcome of this election is. He has broken the taboo about socialism in this country. He has made it possible for millions of Americans to once again think about that and what it means and what its different interpretations are and where it's been and where it might be going and what it means to talk seriously and systematically about an alternative to capitalism. That's a priceless gift that he found himself in a position to provide us. I don't think I know that he did not imagine that he would have anything like the response that he has had when he decided to do this. A leading official in the Democratic Party that I've known most of my life told me in September of last year that they were concerned in the Democratic Party that if Mr. Sanders entered the race, he would pick up between 1% and 3% of the vote. And they were concerned because in close races in a number of states, that would be more than enough to swing the outcome. And in a winner-take-all system of the sort we have, that could determine the outcome and damage their efforts. That's what they thought they were facing. So when you hear about the concerns of the Democratic leadership around Hillary Clinton, concerns that they win the election, that's a concern to do something they never thought was even in question a bare few months ago. For better or worse, Mr. Sanders' entourage didn't have one iota better of an understanding of what they were getting into when they did. So everybody is running around surprised by what they've tapped into. The second thing that I believe his campaign is showing is visible in the streets here. For millions of American people, they're discovering that thinking that Bernie Sanders is an attractive candidate is something that millions of Americans agree with them about. This is an absolute transformation of their sense of who they are, what this country is, and what is possible. You're going to see, you're already seeing it, a whole generation of Americans of all ages beginning to think that political projects are possible in this country that they had written off as pure utopian fantasy before, to be indulged when you had drunk too much or smoked too much, depending on your preference, and that would pass by the time you woke up tomorrow morning. Now, the reality of what's possible is opened up in a way that I like the phrase, the genie is out of the bottle and nobody's going to push him back in. It's too late. It's out. And if I'm right, if those are the big achievements, then there are achievements already in the bag. He's already done it. And nothing that happens from now on will change that. I am not suggesting that you do not vote next Tuesday if you feel so inclined. You certainly should. But this is a historic transformation in this country. I don't think it can be overstated, even though I might be doing that. I don't think so. I think this is the culmination of lots of things that have built up over decades, and it's not gonna go away. It's gonna explode, just as these rallies are exploding. And let me also catch you up to some things I've done that are relevant to what we do here since I last spoke with you on the second Wednesday of March. Since that time, I have made 3 speaking trips. This is the time of year when I do a lot of that. So the first one was at the end of March. And there I flew to Cincinnati, Ohio, to speak at the University of Northern Kentucky, which is in a suburb across the river from Cincinnati. It's a commuter school, big university, 15,000, 20,000 students, State University of Kentucky. And people in Cincinnati are the commuters who go there. I spoke to a very large crowd of very enthusiastic students and faculty. These are experiences the likes of which I never had before until the last 3 or 4 or 5 months. The excitement is incredible, the commitment, the level of education, the enthusiasm, it is extraordinary. And I have to admit, I'm not proud of it, I do have to admit I had never been in Kentucky in my life. The concept of Kentucky is, in my mind, sort of right next to the concept of the moon. It's so distant. I don't know why, just the way I grew up, Kentucky is a concept I have a hard time getting my brain around. The next day after I did my stint in the University of Northern Kentucky, my hosts drove me about an hour and a half to Lexington, Kentucky. I learned a number of interesting things. I was taken to a place called, anyone here from Lexington, Kentucky? No. A place in the downtown, which is kind of a memorial space called Cheapside, where I was told it was the largest slave market in the United States. In the period of slavery, more African Americans were bought and sold in this market than anywhere else. Well, there's something to think about. And to the credit of the people of Lexington, it's a kind of memorial. It's a place you don't want to forget what that means and what it meant. And then I spoke at the University of Kentucky, which is located in Lexington, Kentucky. And the audiences were bigger. And the enthusiasm was, if anything, greater. So I had as good an experience with 400 or 500 people, all told, that I spoke to in Kentucky than I ever imagined. And so I want you all to know that in Kentucky, too, this transformation, another version of which is out in the street, is going on. The next trip I took was it was very recent. It was Friday and Saturday of last week. I flew to Syracuse, New York, and I spoke one evening, Friday night in Syracuse, and Saturday night in Ithaca, which is less than an hour by car from Syracuse. Ithaca is the home of 2 universities, Cornell University and Ithaca College, which is a very big university, both private. Again, my audiences in Syracuse and Ithaca were extraordinarily large, but again, more impressive than the size was the enthusiasm, the excitement, the determination to be politically active in and far beyond the Bernie Sanders campaign. Most of the people in these places wore Bernie buttons or shirts or hats. But what was interesting was their determination that this is the beginning and not the end of their political commitment. For many of them, they've never done this before. A good number of them have not voted for a while, are now voting. They're excited about their sense of being caught up in a historical change. And that was one of the lessons I took away. And then yesterday I flew to Boston. And last night I spoke at a place called Simmons College. It's a fairly well-known women's school, only women, undergraduates. They have men and women in the graduate programs, right in the middle of downtown Boston. And there we had 250, maybe 300 people, half of whom young women of the ages 19 to 23. And again, as several of them said to me with great earnestness, we had a dinner before I gave my talk, that they have made a commitment in their lives, they were explaining to me, as if they were describing a career choice, that they have made a decision that what this country needs is a revolution, a fundamental change. It won't do, they said, for these little things, these little adjustments. It's too late for that. The problems are too deep, the needs are too great, and they wanted to hear me explain. They asked me to talk about the system, the problem of the system, and what system change might mean and what it might look like, because that's what they're interested in. I've been doing this a long time. I've not seen this before. And I've not seen that many people. I've not seen that level of commitment. I've not seen the level of understanding they're bringing. The books and articles these students talk to me about. I mean, I'm a teacher. I know what I can expect. These are people who've done way more than the reading that was assigned to take the course, because they're motivated more than that. And so they've been working kind of on their own with a few teachers. The economics department at Simmons College is very unusual. It has people in it that don't tell anybody. Marxists. And they've been doing their work, and the students showed. It's a private school. It's not. It's expensive. It's a school that not everybody can go to. But it was a remarkable experience. Very, very energizing for me. And I flew back here this afternoon, and here I am to do my stint in a situation where I know we're down a bit from our normal attendance because of the obstacle course that was created for you all to get here. Okay, so that much about the times we live in and what they might mean. So let me talk a little bit about some of the bigger events in economics that happened since last month, and then get to our main topic, which is the history, the varieties, and the future of socialism. There's too many things this last month. I can't cover them all. It's a little bit overwhelming. More than in the past. I don't know whether capitalism is falling apart at a faster rate, and so there's just too much for me to report on or talk to you about. So let me pick a few, but I'm not claiming that they're the most important. There's just a lot of them. One thing is so delicious that I really cannot forbear. Somebody who we all owe a debt to got into the records of a law firm in Panama and exposed millions of their files for years, making it possible for us to see what is going on in law firms, a lot of them. This is just one of many law firms in Panama. And you should be aware that what these law firms in Panama are doing is the same thing as law firms are doing in lots of other places. The British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Switzerland, despite the changes there in recent years, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg. And here in the United States, a number of states are real specialists in this. Of course, the most important is Delaware. You might think that Delaware is a small place. You'd be right. But it has a number of law firms and corporate headquarters that are literally stupefying in their sheer number. Nevada is another such state, and South Dakota, I believe. Well, both of the Dakotas are also specialists in this arrangement. Some of you may have noticed that your bank has a peculiar address in South Dakota. This is not because they find South Dakota attractive. In the winter, for example, it isn't. I'm going to get emails about this, I know, but it's cold. They are there because the law permits banks to do things if you're headquartered in South Dakota that you can't do in many other states. So they play the role within the United States that the Panamanians and others play in the world. What is it they basically do? It's really very, very simple. They set up phony companies. What do I mean by a phony company? It's a company that doesn't produce anything. It doesn't make a good, doesn't make a service. It just exists as a kind of smokescreen, a company whose job it is to own another company. And this company that they set up, who simply owns another company, is in turn owned by still another company, which they also set up, which is in turn owned by another. You get the picture. They set up a series of companies in a place where you are not required to list on any document who the owners are of the company. So by having a layer of companies between an actual existing asset or business and the actual owner, you make it impossible to discern the owner. So if you look it up, this company is owned by that company. And you look it up, and this company's owned by that. It just keeps going until you literally can't pursue it anymore. So what does it mean? It means it's a way of disguising who owns what. Good. Why would you want to do that? Well, that's like asking a person, why would you want to have a secret? There are as many answers as there are persons. There are loads of reasons why you might want to hide the fact that you own something. I'm going to give you just a few examples to show you the richness of this phenomena. You are, I'm going to pick little ones and then we'll get to the big ones. You are, of course, no one in this room would be in this situation, but you are contemplating divorce. And you are worried that in the process of divorce, you're going to lose your assets because your partner or soon-to-be ex-partner is going to get a better lawyer than you can afford, and you aren't going to be left with much other than your socks. In order to avoid this problem, you need to separate yourself from any demonstrable ownership of anything so that the lawyer for your ex can sue you all they want, but they cannot ascertain what you have, and so they can't get it. There's a reason. Here's another reason. You wish to engage in an illegal activity. I know this is frightening for you to imagine, but there are companies in the world who regularly contemplate, can you believe it, illegal acts. So illegal that they know they might get caught. And if they were caught, they would be subject to suits, civil suits, and criminal actions that would deprive them of their assets unless, of course, the complainant couldn't find out what their assets were. So you hide them as a way to prepare for the illegal act you're about to perform, and therefore you make sure you don't get hurt in the event that you're caught. Good, we're enjoying this. You should enjoy this. I am giving you lessons about how capitalism works, and always has. But there are more reasons, many more reasons. You are a politician, and you have been stealing your country blind. I know this may come as a shock, but there are politicians who do this. Currently, there's a newspaper story which I urge you to take a look at. It's about the country of Malaysia. The president of Malaysia is currently in a condition which is technically called deep doo-doo. And that is because he has been caught depositing or having deposited in his personal accounts, I want you to admire this fellow with me, $700 million. No chicken feed here. This man clearly understands that if you're going to do this thing, do it big. The country of Malaysia, not a rich country, is having trouble locating $4 billion, which seem to have gone missing. If you want, just Google 1MBD, I believe is the name of the agency of the government of Malaysia that is now in trouble. It's being investigated in 10 different countries, including here, the United States, because they were active all over the world. This, by the way, is an example of high finance. Well, if you're a politician and you have a lot of money, perhaps you got it illegally, who knows, but you don't want your constituents to know either that you have a lot of money, or were they to know that you have a lot of money, they might begin to ask you embarrassing questions about, like, I don't know, where'd you get it? The job you had couldn't in 50,000 years generate that amount of money, so you must have gotten it someplace else. Could you please account for it? you know, your political enemies could ask you that question. It's embarrassing. So you'd hide it so that people wouldn't know about it. And that's what you can do with a layer of shell companies, they're called, these things that that firm, Fonseca and, what was it, Mossacker, I believe, and Fonseca in Panama got caught doing. And this has already gotten a number of politicians in deep trouble. The Prime Minister of Iceland resigned within hours of the release of the first group of tapes. And poor David Cameron, the Prime Minister of England, had to admit, embarrassing him in the House of Commons and in the press, that his father had established shell companies with that firm in Panama, and that he, Mr. Cameron, had personally benefited from it, but as he explained to the British people, it wasn't a lot, indicating that he doesn't quite grasp what's at stake here and hopes it will all go away. But the probability of Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, whom I've talked to you about before, and who is something like the British equivalent of Bernie Sanders, rough equivalent, his prospects of doing better in the next British election just got much improved because his opponent, Mr. Cameron, is looking like what he probably is. Now here we get to the biggest one I left for last. The biggest reason you hide your assets is if they're the kinds of assets that generate an income. For example, portfolios of stocks and bonds that generate interest income or dividend income, or there are businesses that are generating a profit from whatever they do. If you can't be traced to it, and this business doesn't pay taxes, you are probably safe. You don't announce anything, and no one can kind of trace it to you, and so you now have tax-free income. This is extremely exciting. Even all of you would probably be excited if you didn't have to pay taxes. And this firm has become very, very wealthy. This Mossacker, was it Mossacker? Mossack or Mossack? And Fonseca. Mossack, I did a little research, some of you may have noticed this. Mossack, poor fellow, is a German immigrant in Panama. How came a German immigrant to be in Panama? Turns out that his father was a member of something called the Waffen-SS. Not a good thing in German history, although many folks were in that organization. And at the end of the war, like a good number of them, they took off, realizing it would be better to be someplace else now that that project was destroyed. And many of them went to Latin America. He went to Panama, hooked up with an unknown local lawyer named Fonseca, and they are now very, very wealthy, having done this for countless entities. The biggest partners for this law firm were major global banks, in particular HSBC, UBS, and I believe Credit Suisse. Why? Because when big banks have very rich clients, the clients talk to their friendly banker, and they say to the banker, in so many words, "I need to hide my money." "No problem," says the banker, calls up his friend in the law firm, and they make 47 companies that nobody can ever figure out who. Wow. Let's see now. Is this significant in the world? Well, we have some research to help us. There's a professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley, named Gabriel, I'm just mentioning this if any of you wish to pursue this, Gabriel Zuckman, Z-U-C-M-A-N. First name Gabriel, last name Zuckman. He works as part of a team with a professor there named Emmanuel Saez, S-A-E-Z, who is a partner in research for 30 years of Thomas Piketty, who is the French economist you all heard about because we've talked about him here and he's been in the press a great deal. Piketty and Saez are the major researchers on wealth in the United States, distribution of wealth in the world and in the United States. And one of the, I believe he's a student of theirs who's now a colleague of theirs, Gabriel Zuckman. He wrote a book a year or two ago called, cleverly, playing with Adam Smith. His book was entitled The Hidden Wealth of Nations. Right? And he shows in his book, which I urge you to take a look at, his estimate, if I remember, is in the nature of $7 to $8 trillion is hidden. Now, why is this enough? By the way, estimates go as much as 3 times that, 4 times that. I've seen them as high as $25 to $30 trillion. Clearly, this is an area where being precise about things is silly. You can't do it. But it's enough for us to know that not only do we live in a world that I have documented for you countless times, where taxes have been lowered on corporations and the rich, but it's not enough for corporations and the rich. It's not enough to have low taxes. They would prefer no taxes, and this is one way to get it done. So you might want to ask yourself, if corporations around the world have hidden $7 to $8 trillion worth of stuff or more, thereby generating, who knows, $1 trillion or more of income that isn't paying taxes, what the world could do with the amount of money that could be raised if you simply taxed these people at the same rate that's applied to everybody who hasn't hidden his or her money in a Panamanian, okay? And you can do it in lots of places. Any of you are interested, come talk to me afterwards, and I'll tell you. A half a dozen places where you just have to take a little trip on an airplane, ask at the local airport where to go, and they'll send you, and you'll discover, as I did, so I do know whereof I speak, that they will direct you to offices, office buildings. And you'll go to the office building, and out in front of the office building will sit, a guard. No tension at all. He's sitting on a chair, eating a banana, drinking a bourbon, enjoying life. And you'll say to him, hey, I went into the lobby, sir, and I noticed that the building has 5 floors, and on the list of the companies that have offices here, I noticed 6,000 companies. And I don't understand how you get 6,000 companies in this little building. And the man will explain to you, smiling, he's just encountered a moronic tourist. And he's going to help the tourist understand. These are just the word that was used in my case, these are just mail drops. I asked, it sounded like something you take for a cough. No, a mail drop is literally a mailbox. You pay a person in the building, one of the few people in the building, and he or she opens the mail in 1,000 mailboxes. That's their job. And if there's something there, they have an instruction where to send it. That's it. Meanwhile, your company is located in Panama. Why? Because the tax on profits in Panama is nothing. Oh, that's a good place to have your business located because the profit is nothing. Not a problem for many of these companies since they don't have any profit. But in case they do, they don't have to pay any tax on it anyway. So the next time you pay a tax, recognize that's because you're not rich. As a very famous American comedian once said, George Carlin, the rich have all the money and pay no taxes. The middle class does all the work and pays all the taxes. And the poor class, that's there to scare the shit out of the middle class. I would never use a word like that, but I'm just quoting George Carlin, and he did. Those of you who know George Carlin know that that was not the worst of the words he was comfortable using. George Carlin and Richard Pryor had a contest who could use more of those words in any 12-minute segment of their comedic routine. It's a remarkable story of yet another dimension of a capitalist system, which has always worked this way. And when on occasion it's caught, as the Swiss were not too many years ago, a big thing went through, and Switzerland said we'll never do it again, and the people moved their money out of Switzerland into Panama. And now there will be a Panama, and we will discover 5 or 10 years from now that it's in Honduras or someplace else. There are 180 countries last time I looked, so there's lots of opportunity to move from here to there, and countries around the world make a specialty of making themselves attractive because that's a way of getting some fees and other things by the companies that come in. That's why Delaware has always done what it has done, Nevada the same, South Dakota, North Dakota, and so on. Hiding your wealth and not paying taxes is a major capitalist sport. And capitalists of any size play that sport. And it's something to keep in mind the next time they explain why other people need to deal with it. Yes, sir.
When the story broke, the story in the Times, it was a Sunday or Monday, I think, what shocked me about it, I looked up the population of Panama. It's about 4.8 million people. There's a picture of like 150, 60, 70-story office buildings right in the center of town. What are all these people doing?
Exactly.
Lots of mail drops.
Lots of mail drops, a lot of people with a good job opening and closing mailboxes. Which is a very important contribution to economic development, as you can tell. It has all kinds of spillover effects and technological. It's wonderful. Open the envelope, tear it open, glue it back, mail it somewhere else. And there's a university to train people how to do that better. Okay, let's leave it. Go to the next one. Next topic, to being quick here. Mr. and Mrs. Clinton got themselves into a problem since we last met that had to do with the crime bill that was passed under Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Black Lives Matter confronted, I believe it was Mrs. Clinton or perhaps Mr. Clinton, I don't remember which, or both of them, pointing out that that crime bill contributed to the really stupefying statistics. For those who've never looked at the statistics of this country's incarcerated people, we incarcerate more as a percentage of our population than any other country on the earth. So we are the most prison-ridden society there is. But if you look at the statistics, African American and Hispanic Americans are like 3/4 or more of the total imprisoned population. So they're so completely out of whack with their percentage of the population that anybody, just prima facie, something is wrong here, unless you believe that some people are predisposed to being criminals or being caught at it anyway than others. Anyway, they confronted the Clintons, and the Clinton answer was, well, maybe that shouldn't have happened, but we passed the crime bill because actually African American people wanted less crime in their neighborhoods, so we were responding to a desire or a request of those people. And presumably they had in mind Hispanic Americans too, since they're the ones that are incarcerated. So I wanted to comment. I don't know about you, I found this stupefying to read, this interaction. So let's first be fair. The problem of rising crime rates in the United States existed before Mr. Clinton became president. So blaming the crime on him, which might have been fun for Republicans to do, that's not serious. I'm not going to deal with that, number one. Number two, the rising response to crime rates by imprisoning large numbers of African American, particularly men, overwhelmingly men, and Hispanic Americans, also is older than Clinton becoming president. So blaming either the crime or the incarceration on the Clintons is, I mean, just the numbers don't work like that. So what can we say? Well, something happened in the 1970s. We know that because if I don't have the wherewithal to do it, but if I showed you a chart of the number of Americans in jail, both in a federal prison and in a local jail, it goes like this from the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, the 1950s, 60s, and then in the 70s, phew, it goes off the chart. So obviously something in the 1970s went terribly wrong in the United States, whether you look at yes, with the
and black folks.
black folks in the hip. Yes, I'm going to get to that. But something happened there in the 1970s that began to go crazy, that produced a rise in crime statistics, and it produced a rise in incarceration as the response, maybe, to the crime statistics. Okay, I would like to, I'm an economist, so I'm going to look at this through the lens of an economist. The 1970s is when the rising wages that I've talked to you about many times, 150 years from the 1820s to the 1970s, wages rose in the United States. And by wages, I mean what we call real wages. The wages a person gets adjusted for the prices they have to pay. So it's a measure of what you can actually afford to get with whatever your pay is, right? You all understand that. It's not a good thing for you if your wages go up by 10% and all the prices of what you buy go up for 10%, because then the 10% is negated. You're not one step ahead because your money doesn't go any further now than it did before, right? So we make an adjustment for that. The real wage measures the amount of increase in wages taking into account whatever the prices are and what happened to them. So real wages rose for 150 years in the country. That's where we got this crazy idea that we live in a charmed country, that we have American exceptionalism, that God loves us better than he or she, I don't want to offend anybody, likes other people. We live in a place where everybody will live better than their parents and grandchildren will live better than you and all the rest of it. Because it was true for 150 years. It stopped in the 1970s. It stopped, and it never resumed. The real wage in the United States today is roughly what it was in the late 1970s, gone absolutely nowhere. Now, if you have a society that for 150 years enjoys rising real wages and suddenly it stops, that is cause for something that psychologists can call a trauma. It's a shock. And how do you cope with the shock? Well, I believe psychology also teaches that a trauma is bad, but a trauma you can't talk about with anybody, that makes it worse. That's even worse. We were a nation that suffered a traumatic end of rising wages, and there was no discussion at all. No political leader of any importance ever brought it to the attention of the American people, even though the statistics were showing it starting in the 1970s and continued to show it in the 80s and 90s and right to this minute. So here's a shock, undiscussed, unprocessed, unworked through. And Americans had to cope. And they coped as best they could individually. Remember, I've talked to you in earlier say, workers did more hours of work. Women, white women, left the home and to become paid employees. Black women had that enjoyment already earlier. White women joined it. Old people learned the special joys of becoming a greeter at Walmarts. Okay? These kinds of opportunities were exploding, but it wasn't enough. And so Americans did that other thing. They borrowed money. Remember, I told you, starting in the 1970s, the debts of the Americans went crazy. To the home debt, which we already had, mortgage debt, was added car payment debt, then the credit card, which only became a mass phenomenon in the 1970s, and then the new one of the last 20 years, student debt. We can figure out ways to indebt our people like there's no tomorrow. That traumatized the people who could do those things. But what we haven't asked is what happened to the people who got really hurt? Because every time there's a difficulty in a capitalist system, it's kicked down. Everybody tries to manage this trauma, but those who have more resources pull it off. Those who don't get kicked, and they got no way to help themselves. It pushed the pressure down. Each segment of society tried to cope by pushing the burden off on the segment below them. So where do we get? The ones already at the bottom, African American, the usual story, are the ones left in trouble. So what happens? Unemployment begins to be a real problem in this country in the 70s and 80s. We didn't have, in the 50s and 60s were really a pretty good time, employment-wise, coming out of the Great Depression. Well, I make you a proposal as an economist. We had terrible difficulties for people, particularly in the lower half of the population. Disproportionately African American, Hispanic American, and plenty of whites too, but I mean a disproportionate amount of African Americans and Hispanic Americans. They didn't have the jobs, or the jobs they had were no good. The jobs couldn't go anywhere. The depressed economy of no more rising wages was working its terrible, and crime became an attractive alternative for people whose opportunities were nowhere. Sure they did. Sure they did. And then the question is, how does a society handle this trauma of the end of it? Especially, how does a society deal with it if it can't discuss the fact, what do we do as a society? Our wages are not going anywhere. And just to remind you, why did the wages go nowhere? Because capitalists abandoned the United States starting in the 1970s. They moved production elsewhere. That's why you couldn't get more wages. The relationship between supply and demand of jobs had changed. The employers' demands were for jobs of foreigners whom they could pay much less to, and they're not going to raise a wage here. They're just not going to do it, and they didn't need to. So the interesting thing about this society was, as it made life harder and harder for everybody, that's why we went into debt like we were crazy. That's why we work ourselves more paid hours of work per year for an American than any other people. But what we also did was provoke real problems at the bottom, one of whose expressions, only one of many, was crime. And then the brilliant response was to incarcerate people, to respond to this failure of an economic system, failure of a society to cope with the end of rising wages, an end of rising wages for which no person who is completely crazy could have blamed African Americans or Hispanic Americans. They were not responsible for capitalists leaving, and they weren't responsible for wages not rising. They had nothing to do with it. But they were the victims of the way this society mishandled its own difficulty. Mishandled even to the point of never discussing it or understanding it. So as the crimes begin to grow, people panic. Because the crime was so bad, it was the same reason people have panicked at other times. They understand, even if they can't put their fingers on it, that the world is changing in scary ways. The jobs aren't there, the futures aren't there, the possibilities aren't there. The anxiety of a job became much realer after the 1970s. As you accumulated debt, the anxiety of what would happen if you lost your job or you got sick and you couldn't pay that mortgage at the end of the month. You couldn't pay the car payments. Well, I mean, these anxieties, you know, they play a role in your health, mental and physical. But this is a society that was looking for something to fix its, and it fixed on something. It fixed on jailing scary people. People different from yourself, people who looked frightening, people who you associated with scary thoughts. Put them in jail. To understand this, you need to look at the last few years. When Americans are worried about, get ready. Ready? Terrorists. What? Terrorists. You know, terrorists. I don't know. What's a terrorist? The answer is, nobody knows what the terrorist is. You, me, or the next guy. Terror. You have a war against terror. I'm having a war against stones. or trees. What is this? But you know, looking back a few years from now, people are going to say we were all crazy. What? We're going to search the world for terrorists. That could be anybody. Exactly. That's the point. It could be anybody. We can go anywhere. We're always finding terrorists. Whoever we kill is a terrorist. You know how we know? Because we killed them. No, but this is serious. We have a drone and it goes, and it wipes out a group of people celebrating somebody's wedding. But it turns out that was just a ruse. They were really, ready? Terrorists. We read a newspaper, it must be terrorists. So if you find that bizarre, then putting a lot of people in jail. And how do we know that it's crazy? Because everybody in America, starting in the 1980s, understood something. They did. They understood that putting a person in jail in this country can and will only make them worse. Every late night comedian on television makes jokes about if you're in jail, don't bend over. If that has to be explained to you, I can't help you. You just think about it. Right? You all laugh. We've been trained to laugh because it's funny. We all know that jail is a place of rampant sexual assault. It is. I got a suggestion for you. If we have a lot of people that are troubled, maybe have committed a crime, maybe not, but are in trouble with the police, putting them in a place where they're likely to be sexually assaulted is probably not a good idea. Building lots of institutions, prisons, where we can put lots of people into that situation, probably not a good idea. Why would a society of presumably not lunatics believe it has a problem which it's going to solve by putting people into an institution that will make them worse when they come out than they were when they went in? As anybody would be in the conditions of American jails, as has been documented so many times. I don't really need to do it again, do I? We handle the collapse of our society by making a joke about sexual assaults at jail. It has to be made funny because the alternative is a level of horror that really would be hard to live with. So we make it into a ha-ha and hope that everybody handles it as an amusement you don't have to think about.
$50,000 a year to every prisoner profit.
Right. And now, of course, to save money for the government, since it's very expensive, we now farm it out more and more to private prison companies because they can handle the prisoner at less money. You think the prisoner was in trouble in a public institution where he was abused. Now, put him in an institution where they're spending less money on him, because that's how they make it pay, then, of course, his situation is going to get much better. What? What? Of course, it's a question only of efficiency. Private, as we all know, is always more efficient than public. We know that's true because it's in the textbooks. And we know that the people who write textbooks are truth tellers. They have that because they went to the university where their teachers were also truth tellers, and so they come from a long, you get the picture. Remarkable. Remarkable. And what is the Clintons' role in this? They didn't cause any of it, but they didn't stop any of it either. They went right along with the program. They made deals to get that bill passed in 1994, and those deals included many more prisons, many more police officers, as a very well done, by the way, I must admit. There's an op-ed in today's New York Times on the back page by 3 writers who spell out what this is and what happened, what the Clintons are responsible for. It's excellent. The op-ed page, today's New York Times. If you have not read it, read it. It'd make the case better than I can. But the Clintons just, they bought into the crime is the problem. They bought into jails are the solution. They brought into all of that. Okay. Let me turn. There were other Well, one more short one because I can't resist. The saga of Puerto Rico. For those of you that have a moment, take a look. Puerto Rico, as I've tried to suggest to you, is looking more and more like the Greece of the Western Hemisphere, the Greece of America, like Greece is the Greece of Europe. The country on which your disintegrating economic system works its worst vengeance, its worst abuse, its worst austerity. Every day now there's news about it. The Congress of the United States is trying to decide whether to give the Puerto Rican government the right not to pay off the $72 billion in debt that Puerto Rico has accumulated. Puerto Rico is an island of 3.5 million people. The poorest part of the United States has a debt of $72 billion. I mean, you ought to laugh, except crying would be the more appropriate response. And the governor of Puerto Rico has announced we can't pay. Or to be more accurate, what he has said, and what is the truth, is the only way they can pay, and they have a big bill coming up in May and another one, I believe, in June or July. The only way they can pay that is if they literally stop having police officers in large parts of the island, fire departments, teachers. For those of you paying attention, the last 2.5 weeks have been some of the biggest demonstrations at the University of Puerto Rico in its history, as Puerto Rican students at those universities, the different campuses, are rising up as they're being told what the government's going to do, even if it gets a break, let alone what it's going to have to do if it doesn't get a break. And what does a break mean? Not paying back. So a moment's economic analysis. Because what happened in Puerto Rico is exactly what happens everywhere else in the United States. Indeed, one of the troubles the United States Congress is having trying to figure out how to save this situation. And by the way, just like Europe, what does it mean, save the situation? They got to do something in Puerto Rico, because if they don't, 1 million Puerto Ricans are coming here. That's just like Syrians, just like Libyans, just like Turks, just like Kurds. Should I go on? Look, you see what's happening in Europe with the problems they have? They are bombing large areas. That accelerates the process. Many people seem to wish to avoid being bombed. Puerto Rico isn't being bombed, at least not yet, but they're being economically strangled. And there's no work, and there's no jobs, and there's no public support. I told you last time, the sales tax has been raised in Puerto Rico to 11.5%. Try to understand. You buy a candy bar, 11.5%. Nowhere in the United States is there anything like that. The poorest place has the highest sales tax. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. Nobody would believe it. So we have to solve the problem of Puerto Rico, because if we don't, they're going to come here. And there's no work here for them. So what are they going to do? Well, however bad it is here, we were making it worse there, so they'll come here. Especially because they can. They're citizens. They don't have to go through other kinds of problems. They have to be let in, unless that changes too. Who knows? Well, what happened here is a very cozy economic relationship. If you get this, you'll see, because part of what the Congress is trying to do is to come up with a fix here. Because the next state of this country coming down the pike, just a little bit better off than Puerto Rico, is the state of Illinois, whose economic condition is just a little better than Puerto Rico, except the difference is Illinois is very large. And a collapse there, no one knows. No one knows. So what happened? Here's how this works. You have a collection of political leaders in a place like Puerto Rico, or for that matter, a place like Illinois, it doesn't matter. And they need to build a political career. And typically they come, not infrequently, from modest families, maybe even working class families, and make it up through the political game. And what they want is what they've seen others do, to become rich and powerful by being a political leader. And how do you do that? you quickly discover you're not going to become rich and powerful by raising taxes off of rich people or companies or for the masses either. They don't want to pay taxes. So if you want to be a successful politician, don't raise taxes. Everybody will hate you. By the same token, you must deliver services. Rich people have a whole list of things they want you to do. Corporations have a whole list of things they want you to do, and the masses have a list of things they want you to do. You better do some of them. Otherwise, they'll hate you, just like you can't raise taxes, but you must deliver service. This is a problem, because the only way you can pay for taxes, the only way you can pay for services is if you raise taxes, but that's not correct, is it? There is an alternative that every clever politician learns about, usually when they're 6 or maybe 6 and a half. There is an alternative. You can, ready, here you go, you can borrow the money. You can borrow. And not only can you borrow, turns out it's very easy. You go to a handful of lenders with strange names like Bank of America, or Citibank, or Wells Fargo, or any of them. They are eager to lend you money. So you go to them and you say, hey, lend us a lot of money. And then you go to the rich and the corporations and say, hey, loads of money. I can build the road that you want. I can give you a subsidy, give you a tax break. You don't even have to pay. I got so much money from the bank. It's great. And if the masses are making noise, you give them a little something to build some swimming pools. Give them a daycare program. Not a lot, because it's expensive, but it's some. And write a set of laws, here we go now, that make the people as a whole the ultimate guarantor of the loan from the bank to Puerto Rico. That's what they did. And they kept doing it, and they kept doing it. And a whole series of politicians became rich and famous over 30 years arranging the loans. They got fees, finder's fees. By the way, you want to see a wonderful story, a momentary glimpse into it? Again, I can't believe that I'm doing this since it's a newspaper I do not admire. But today's New York Times has a story in the business section about the current representative of Puerto Rico in the United States Congress. And the remarkable story of his name, Luis, I don't know his exact name, but the story's beautiful about how his wife started a public relations firm about 3 weeks after he was elected, and it has been helping, oh boy, lenders find the way to lend, and now they are very rich, these two. He who is sitting in the Congress, and she who has her own consulting firm, which has no relationship to anything he does. How do we know that? Because he says so in today's newspaper. You have to enjoy this. You need a breath to catch this in all of its glory. Or George Carlin. But they are both dead, so you'll have to have me do a poor imitation. That's what and that's everywhere. The politicians of Illinois is exactly the same. Get the loans. Appear to be, go on the television and say, vote for me, I lowered your taxes. Yes, you did, you jerk. You didn't tax rich people and corporations, you smelly fellow. Instead, you borrowed. And of course, if you take 10 seconds to look at, who do they borrow from? Of course, they borrow from the rich and the corporations. And the reason the rich and the corporations have the money to lend to the government is because the government didn't tax it away from them. Do you understand this? This is public finance 101. You're the favorite of the corporations because instead of taxing them to pay for what a society ought to have, you don't tax them. Instead, ready, you borrow the money from them, which you have to give back, and while they wait, you pay them interest. Oh, I really should stop and just play the national anthem for a few minutes so we can all appreciate this. So what's being fought out in Puerto Rico is actually the same issue with all the other 50 states in this country. It's the same issue. A vast debt that is socialized. Everybody, we all have to pay the debt. But it was contracted by a handful of political leaders with a handful of lenders who made a fortune off of this. Fees in the act of the loan being arranged, interest for a dozen years. Even if now they don't get paid the full amount that they lent, they're still ahead. They've made so much money that they can get back only 80 cents on the dollar. It's still a good investment. By the way, you know it's a good investment because they made the loan knowing full well what they understand it better than you do. They do this all the time. There are special offices in this Citibank and Goldman Sachs to work this out. They go from one country to another. They know exactly how to do this, and what they do is the same. That's why Puerto Rico is the future of Illinois. That's a different thing. Let me turn now, since I've used more time than I should. Socialism. Okay. The first thing to say about socialism is, for you all to understand, is very old. Socialism is as old as capitalism. Why? Because socialism is capitalism's shadow. Capitalism has always, like every other system, produced people who love it and produced people who hate it. That's not peculiar to capitalism. People in slavery loved it and hated it. Some people even managed both. People in feudalism, there were those who thought it was the greatest thing ever, and there were those who were hostile to it. Every system has had its devotees, its supporters, and its critics. Capitalism is no different. From the beginning, whether you look at 17th century England or wherever it spread to in the subsequent centuries, capitalism produced those who loved it and those who hated it. Anyone who ever wanted to understand capitalism, anyone who had half a brain, knew that to understand such a system, you would have to read or listen to the arguments of those who loved it, and listen to and hear the arguments of those who hate it, and then draw a conclusion. Just like if you wanted to understand a family up the road, mother, father, 2 kids, one thought it was the greatest family ever, the other one hated the family. If you wanted to understand the family, would you talk to one of the 2 children? That'd be weird. Really weird. So weird that it isn't any more interesting about the family, it's just about you. What's the matter with you that you would do such a bizarre thing? So if you want to understand capitalism, you have to study those who thought it was great and wonderful and loved it, by all means, and those who were critical. For the last 50 years or 60 years in the United States, you couldn't do what I just described as minimally reasonable. In 99, and I'm not exaggerating, 99% of this country's universities and schools and places of public discussion, you could listen all day long to people who loved it, and you'd have a very hard time finding anyone who would talk to you about what's wrong with it. This is a society that is childish. And if you aren't a childish nation, and I don't believe we are, you'd have to explain why a nation that isn't childish behaves in a childish way. This behavior of the last 60 years was the equivalent to what a toddler does. When a scary dog comes into the playground and the little kid is frightened and goes through this wonderful moment. He or she, the little kid, puts their hands in front of their eyes in the wonderful belief that if I can't see the dog, it's not there. It takes another few years of maturation before the child, you and I, discover that when you put your hands there, that's what you're doing. The dog is still there. It doesn't disappear. You don't discuss what's wrong with your system doesn't mean your system is wonderful. That's stupid. And why would people who aren't stupid act in a stupid way? Fear. Fear, ideology, terror. Terror at the other. Terror at what's different. Terror at facing a criticism. Terror at wondering why you're not doing something about a system of which such criticisms could be made. So you handle all the difficulty by pretending the criticism is simply not there. That's how it was handled. You couldn't get a job if you were a Marxist. You couldn't get a job if you were a socialist. I've talked to you at other times about why that happened. That's a response to the history of the Great Depression and the power of the unions and the Socialist and Communist Party. I'm not going to do that again. I want to talk about this long history of socialism as the critical other of capitalism. If you understand what I'm saying, then nothing guarantees the future of socialism and Marxism, Marxism being a particular way of understanding the critique of capitalism. Nothing guarantees the future of those better than capitalism. They're the products of capitalism. Karl Marx is born in 1818, dies in 1883. He's the product of the arrival of capitalism on the mainland of Europe. After it had been in England, it spread to the Low Countries and France and Germany and so on, and it transformed German society, producing Karl Marx, among other things. He's the product. Socialism is the critical response to capitalism. As I've tried to tell you in earlier sessions, it's partly the response of capitalism's own self-celebration. In the French Revolution, the introduction of capitalism into France, the destruction of the feudal system that had held back capitalism from France, getting rid of the feudal system, which the French Revolution did, ending the power of the Roman Catholic Church in France, which mostly the French Revolution did, opened the space for capitalism. And the capitalists said, well, this is, the transition to capitalism is and will be the delivery of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Capitalism would deliver. That's what it is. It's the bringing of liberty, equality, and fraternity. 1789. 50 years later, Marx is an adult man and says, I look around, I see capitalism, I don't see liberty, equality, fraternity. The promise has been broken. The promise was never kept. This system didn't bring what it promised. We got capitalism. And I, Marx, I'm going to try to figure out why that was. What is it about this system that explains how come it didn't bring what it promised, liberty, equality, and fraternity? And what's the answer? And he devoted himself to understanding this system very systematically. So systematically that you have to kind of go, wow, what an achievement. History does that. Periodically it throws up somebody who just captures something, you know? In Detroit's heyday, it was a capitalist mecca. Workers had good jobs. The UAW was a powerful union. It developed a brand new music, Motown. So we can all say, in the middle of all that, it produced Diana Ross. What an amazing person to listen to see her whole, I mean, wow, the whole country was entranced with this woman because she was beautiful and she was a singer like nobody else, or Aretha Franklin. I mean, there's several. Because in these moments, people arise who are simply the sum total of all that's creative in that moment, concentrated in a few of us. It's kind of random. Marx is that. In him is concentrated this critical desire to understand. To make a long story short, he spends a lifetime and he explains that here's the secret. Capitalism did get rid of feudalism, get rid of slavery. But it instituted an alternative economic system, employer-employee. But the secret is that that wasn't the end of the exploitative relationship that slaves had to their masters and serfs had to their lords. That in fact, the employer-employee relationship is just another form of that. You know, this has happened before. You make a revolution, you think you've changed everything, and then you realize what you did is a different society, but you didn't get rid of something that still remains as the bad seed in this story. And Marx says it's that. There's a relationship between the master and the slave, the lord and the serf, which is continued in the relationship between the employer and the employee. And the way he did that was with his theory of the surplus. the master produces more, the slave produces more for the master than the master gives back to the slave to keep him alive. That difference, that surplus, is the master's. The serf works more and produces more than he keeps for himself. That surplus is the rent that goes to the Lord. And the worker, the employee, you in this room, you go to work for a private employer, you produce more in each hour that you work than you are paid. You produce a surplus for the employer, which is why he employs you. And if you didn't produce a surplus for him, you'd be fired. And that's because that's the way that Marx did that work for us. That's what his theory of surplus is about. That's what it's for. And he lays down a challenge. And the fundamental challenge here is, if you don't want the problems of capitalism, you got to deal with this. Because the problems you didn't want with slavery, which is why the human race got rid of it, or with feudalism, now the human race got rid of it, guess what? This capitalism, because it didn't overcome this surplus production by some people for others, is stuck. And what are the particular problems of capitalism that socialists have always focused on? They're very simple. Number one, fundamental inequality. Capitalism, like slavery and feudalism before them, produced stupefying inequality. Some of you have traveled to Europe. You enjoy, Americans often go to be tourists, and if you go, you may go to the Schloss in the German Rhine Valley, or the chateaus of the Loire, and you know why you look at those? Because they're spectacular, they're beautiful You know how they were paid for? Lots of serfs did a lot of surplus, which allowed a few people who got the surplus to have 8 million craftsmen make these beautiful cathedrals or chateaus. You're watching what? A famous Marxist critic once said, every work of art, every work of beauty is also a work of barbarism. Because that beauty is the fruit of a surplus system in which a tiny number of people yanked the surplus out of a mass. I think I told you last time, but I have to tell you one more time. The most important research institute in the world today that studies inequality is not Saez and Piketty, those are the two economists that do it, but an institution that studies world poverty. It's called Oxfam. It's in Britain. It's a British institute. It's been around for decades. 2 months ago, they issued their report for this year, and here's the statistic to take away from it. The 62 richest people in the world, Mr. Gates, Mr. Buffett, most of them are Americans, but not all. The 62 richest Americans, the 62 richest people in the world, both American and non-American, together, put them together, own altogether more wealth than the bottom half of the planet's population. So in this world today, that's 3.5 billion people. We have our population is roughly 7 billion people. So 3.5 billion, the lower half of the planet together has less wealth than 62 people. That's fewer people than are in this room right now. Now, that's a level of inequality for which you have to go back to pharaohs in Egypt and images we can barely remember. The fruit of modern capitalism is to take us backward thousands of years to a level of inequality. And let me drive it home. The bottom half of the population, those are the people who die real young. Those are the people who have every kind of disease there is for which we have the cure, but we can't get it to them because they live over there or they're too poor. They're the ones who suffer every ailment, mental and physical, there is, worse than everybody else. That's what it means. Their housing is worse and their child care is worse. You name it, they suffer. If we took half the wealth of 62 people, half of it, they'd still be the richest people in the world. We could transform the lives of 3.5. There's no religion that I know of that could justify that. There's no ethics I know of that could justify it. We live in a society so grotesquely out of place with everything we claim to value that the only mystery is how we could endorse a capitalism that works this way. So the inequality is the first thing socialists have always looked at. You take the great socialist novels. Americans used to flock to, maybe it's still playing on Broadway, Les Miserables. That's the protest of Victor Hugo against inequality and how it plays itself out. It's a story about an incarcerated person and what happens when he gets away, escapes, and tries to live his life, and is hunted down by a lunatic cop. Should be very modern to us here in America. Émile Zola, Maxim Gorky, Charles Dickens, for all that. These are protests against inequality that are loud and clear and so powerful artistically that we read them still. The second thing socialists have always said about capitalism is it's fundamentally unstable. Every few years, it collapses. And when it collapses, it gives us what? Well, what we have today. Millions of people looking for work. The number in the United States, between 8 and 12 million right now. People looking for work don't have it. The Federal Reserve gives us this number. It's called capacity utilization. What portion of the tools, equipment, factory, and office space is sitting empty? Currently, 20%. That's a lot. So we have millions of people who want a job, and we have all the tools, equipment, and raw material for them to work with. And if they did, we produce an extra $1 to $2 trillion worth of output, which could solve Detroit's bankruptcy, Puerto Rico's difficult. What do? We have it all, but we have a capitalist system that can't put these things together. That is an indictment. Compared to that, the efficiency of producing 12 cans of toothpaste rather than 9 with the same amount of labor is a joke. The efficiency we celebrate doesn't count against the inefficiency of a system that works as badly as that. So socialists have never had a hard time making the case. The case is easy. And with Marx, the logic of it all, the going to the core in the very production relationship is brilliant. The only way to stop a criticism that powerful is to be like a toddler. Put your hands in front of your face and pretend it isn't there. Most of my colleagues in the economics profession cannot have a conversation with me about Marxian economics. Not because they aren't smart, they're plenty smart. But they never read a word about it. As I like to tell you, since it seems to impress some of you, I went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. I'm a product of the elite schools of the United States. I was never required I have a PhD in economics from Yale. I was never required to get my PhD in economics at Yale to read one word of Karl Marx. It wasn't necessary. And it wasn't just Karl Marx. Any critic of capitalism was simply gone. So I can discuss conventional economics with my colleagues because I had to learn that with them. I had to teach it with them. But when I talk about Marxism, I could just as well do it in Urdu. I'm assuming you know that my colleagues don't speak Urdu. Even the ones who come from the place where they speak Urdu, they don't speak Urdu because it's not good for your career to speak Urdu. I'm kidding. So socialism has always existed. Last point. Socialism isn't one thing, it's a variety of things. Nothing that has existed for 200 or 300 years that has spread to every country on the face of the earth. There's no country in the world where there aren't socialist newspapers, socialist, faculties, socialist, organization, socialist union, it's everywhere. Same is true for Marxism. Nothing that spread that fast in a matter of 200 or 300 years, all over the globe, would be one unitary thing. It couldn't. In every culture, it's interpreted in its own way, with the history of that particular place, with the politics of that place, the culture of that place. Marxisms and socialisms are all over the place. So you shouldn't be surprised that, for example, for many people, the difficulties of being a socialist, of pushing the socialist argument, has meant a kind of an accommodation with capitalism. What do I mean? Socialism has come for many people, particularly in the last 60 years, when it was so hard to be a socialist in the United States, but in other parts of the world too. Okay? In that situation, an accommodation was made by many socialists. Here's what the accommodation was. Look, we have to face it. They said to themselves, a whole new world, a whole different way, it's too much. It can't be done. It won't work. So let's accommodate. Let's be reasonable. let's demand of the capitalist society that it be humane, that it be decent, that it be, I don't know, less harsh. And those kinds of socialists said, let's demand as a basic first step of what we want, a commitment to give everybody a job, a commitment to give everybody at least enough to live in a decent way, a public education system, and a kind of support for a medical care system. Let's do what then came to be known as social democracy, particularly in Europe. A kind of socialism. These people were socialists, but they meant by socialism capital, that leave the industries controlled by the people who had been controlling them. Let them make their businesses, let them make their profits, but hedge them about with rules and regulations and taxes so that the government could kind of offset with its programs and its help the harshness of capitalism. The government would play a role. In many parts of the world, many people who thought of themselves as socialists saw that as the best a socialist could hope to achieve, and that then became their goal. They called themselves social democrats or democratic socialists. But then there were always socialists for whom that wasn't enough, who said, you know, the whole point of Marx's insight was that you got a systemic problem here which you are not going to solve no matter how gentler you make this capitalism. It's still capitalism. It's still going to produce inequality. It's still going to be very unstable. And the injustice of all of that is staggering. And it's not enough to be a social democrat or a democratic socialist. You've got to be, and then there were other words, a radical socialist, a communist. There were a variety of terms. A revolutionary, lots of words. It doesn't really matter. It was those who said, no, something more fundamental has to be changed. Americans now, having been out of the woods for so long, unable to discuss, learn, or debate socialism, don't know the varieties of socialism, and they don't know how socialism is changing now. We had in the 20th century two basic efforts, with a lot of little ones alongside, two basic efforts to institute a kind of socialism. One was the Soviet Union, and the other was the People's Republic of China. There were others, but those were the two big ones. The country that's biggest by geography and the country that's biggest by population. That's why they were dominant. And for them, socialism meant something more than social democracy. And they weren't democratic socialists or social democrats. They went further. And further meant we're not just going to have rules and regulations about what the capitalists can do. We're getting rid of the capitalists. The government is going to take over. The government is going to own and operate the factories, the stores, the offices. Oh, that's more than those moderate socialists. They weren't prepared to do that. The Russians, the communists, the Bolsheviks, whatever, they were going to do it. And they also hated the market, this system in which you distribute the goods to the people who have the most money rather than the people who need it the most or what would be best for society. No. You distribute where the money is. This always offended socialists, and they didn't want anything like that. So they wanted the government to plan the distribution. So in the Soviet Union and China, these early experiments understood socialism to be get rid of private enterprise and have the government take over, get rid of the market and have government planning distribute. Now guess what? They achieved some breakthroughs and they failed in some areas. What did they achieve? Because it's so important for you all to understand it so we don't make such terrible mistakes. The Soviet Union first and the People's Republic second are the most successful economic growth stories in the history of this planet. Never anywhere did any society go from poor to rich the way the Russians did from 1917 to 1989 and the Chinese from 1949. There is no end yet. Please, right? In 1917, Russia was the most backward part of Europe. a country in which 95% of the people were illiterate, where everybody was a peasant except for a handful. Poorest part of Russia, then went through losing World War I, not good to do if you're a poor country or any country. Then having a revolution, not good for your economy. Then having a civil war, not good for your economy. Then having a foreign invasion, not good for your economy. And 15 years later, World War II, fought on your soil, not good for your economy. Piss poor to begin with, terrible struggles. By 1975, it's the second world economic power after the United States. Unspeakable, what an achievement. China, even poorer. For those of you who never read a book, an American novelist, Pearl Buck, writes a book called The Good Earth. Some of you may remember it. You may read it. It'll give you an understanding of what China was before the communists take over. Now they are the second economic power in the world. Unbelievable. Biggest country in the world, unspeakably poor, and is now a powerhouse. So when anybody tells you that what that experiment was a failure, no, stop. It was a fantastic success, and it was a failure. What was the failure part of it? They didn't overcome capitalism. They didn't overcome inequality. They didn't overcome instability. I mean, the instability has been so bad, they're not even there anymore. Their downturn after 1975, they couldn't recover. They're gone. And the Chinese are now sitting on a boat that is rocking scarily for everyone. And why not? Because they didn't understand Marx's point. Marx's point is employer-employee. That relationship doesn't manage it. It's just another form of exploitation. You can't read Marx and then begin to believe that if all you do is get rid of the employer who's private and substitute an employer who's public, you've gotten rid of the relationship. You haven't. You've substituted, if I can be allowed, state capitalism for private capitalism. There is a solution that comes out of Marx's theory, but it's not that one. The solution is that the people who produce the surplus have to be the same people who get it and decide what to do with it. That never happened in slavery. That never happened in feudalism. And it never happened in capitalism, neither the private nor the state. That's the breakthrough. That's when you take Marx's theory and you concretely transform the economic system. Workers become their own boss, which shouldn't be a surprise to you because it's the fantasy of 95% of Americans. You ask them what they want in their life, they want to be their own boss. Well, this is the way. This is the only way. You've got to become a collective self-employed. You've got to be a worker co-op, for lack of a better term. And that's what socialism in the 21st century, I believe, is going to become. And we in the United States are now, like in today's evening, we're rediscovering these different ways of understanding socialism. We're going to be debating what I just brought up, pro, con, variations on it. We're discovering that socialism is a big, rich assemblage of notions of how to do better than capitalism. And what you saw coming in tonight, that is a mass of people whose major goal, whose major impulse isn't about socialism, because they don't know enough about it yet. But they know what they don't like, and that's capitalism. And that creates an openness, which Bernie Sanders is widening every minute. An openness, well, okay, if you don't like the way it is, if you don't like being a student loaded up with debt, if you don't like the misery of your parents who can't hold their relationship together because there's too many pressure, if you're looking around and you see it, and you know what you don't like, welcome to the world of socialism with its varying forms who debate and fight with each other, but it's a good fight because it's the fight about people who believe, who want to do better than this system. We are progressive in the best sense of the word. And that's why, for me, Bernie Sanders is a wonderful support for everything I believe, even though the kind of socialism I talk about goes much further than what he is prepared, at least publicly, to speak about. All right, we will continue. Thank you very much. We've come to more than the end.